And the ocean was a space where Hawaiians could still kind of have their autonomy, their sense of a place and a sense of pride. But oftentimes that place on land is different. I'll give you an example. I had a class and we went to Waikiki to study the history of the surfing and Waikiki Beach Boys. And one of my students made an interesting observation. She was watching this guy. She said, we was in the water, had this Hawaiian guy, and he was like, you could tell he was like the chief out there. He was kind of like, nobody would drop in on him. He was catching good waves. He was kind of like at the head of the pecking order. She said she watched him leave the beach, put his board in the rack, walk over to one of the hotels, and instantly he turned into like a bellboy that was like catering to people. And it was a very interesting dynamic where on land you could see the dynamic had shifted. And so we see that a lot. I have another experience with your grandfather. I was out at Macau once. I used to bring my kids all the time to the Rail Sun surfing competition at Macau. And it was late in the evening and the waves were kind of small, and Buffalo paddles out on this big custom bully board. And he paddled way out past everybody, and all of a sudden, like, it was as if the ocean knew that he was there, and this wave out of nowhere came in, and he couldn't stand up anymore because he's pretty old, but he just rode the wave all the way through, straight onto the beach, walked up to the beach, and he was pow. And there is this kind of like special relationship that you see in the ocean that that constitutes, in my opinion, a kind of a pu'uhonua. And so I really like to explore that, and I think that it's intriguing because you get kind of that same sort of vibe here, and it's about having that identity in that space. Now, oftentimes on land, especially when you're talking about colonialism or Western notions of power, they're different from oftentimes indigenous notions of power. And so we see that. I'll tell another story. This is on the Hokulea voyage. I don't mean to talk about your family so much, but I'm very intrigued by this story that is told about Buffalo, and he's on the Hokulea sailing with Ben Finney. This is in 1976 on their way to Tahiti. And the crew decided to put up a sail on Hokulea that the professor, Ben Finney, didn't think was appropriate. It kind of went against the scientific experiment that he had envisioned. And so there's a story of them, the two of them, late at night on the deck of the Hokulea, having this kind of debate about this jib sail. And it's interesting because I think feathers got a little, cocked, and there was kind of like, but the way that Ben Finney asserted his authority was through Western notions of power, which was, I am the president of this voyaging society. I have a PhD from this university, and I am doing this scientific experiment. And to me, I think that's relatable to what's going on today, because you hear that same kind of language between the two sides here on the Mauna today. And it really is using the language of modernity and of authority to justify who's in charge and who's calling the shots. Now, I thought it was very cool. The answer that your grandfather says to Ben Finney is like, you know what, brah, we're on the ocean right now, and this is my domain. And you know what, when the waves get big, and you guys scared, you guys gonna be down on the bottom of the boat crying. I'm gonna be out here sailing this baga. So, what an example. I had a class and we went to Waikiki to study the history of the surfing and Waikiki Beach Boys. And one of my students made an interesting observation. She was watching a wave out of nowhere came in, and he couldn't stand up anymore because he's pretty old, but he just rode the wave all the way through, straight onto the beach, walked up to the beach, and he was pow. And there is this kind of like special relationship that you see in the ocean that that constitutes, in my opinion, a kind of a pu'uhonua. And so I really like to explore that, and I think that it's intriguing because you get kind of that same sort of vibe here, And it's about having that identity in that space. Now, oftentimes on land, especially when you're talking about colonialism or Western notions of power, they're different from oftentimes indigenous notions of power. And so we see that. I'll tell another story. This is on the Hokulea voyage. I don't mean to talk about your family so much, but I'm very intrigued by this story that is told about Buffalo, and he's on the Hokulea sailing with Ben Finney. This is in 1976 on their way to Tahiti. And the crew decided to put up a sail on Hokulea, and it was kind of like, but the way that Ben Finney asserted his authority was through Western notions of power, which was, I am the president of this voyaging society. I have a PhD from this university, and I am doing this scientific experiment. And to me, I think that's relatable to what's going on today, because you hear that same kind of language between the two sides here on the Mauna today. And it really is using the language of modernity and of authority to justify who's in charge and who's calling the shots. Now, I thought it was very cool. The answer that your grandfather says to Ben Finney is like, you know what, brah, we're on the ocean right now, and this is my domain. And you know what, when the waves get big, and you guys scared, you guys gonna be down on the bottom of the boat crying. I'm gonna be out here sailing this bugger. So what essentially he was saying, like, wait a minute, this space on the ocean is different. Your authority doesn't really play out the same way that it does on the moana or on the ocean. And so that concept of the ocean as a social space for Hawaiians to have a kind of autonomy, an identity, empowering identity, it does kind of trump the language or the narrative that we often hear spoken by colonial powers, right? Have a PhD from this university, and I am doing this scientific experiment. And to me, I think that's relatable to what's going on today, because you hear that same concept of the ocean as a social space for Hawaiians to have a kind of autonomy, an identity, empowering identity. It does kind of trump the language or the narrative that we often hear spoken by colonial powers, right? So the ocean as a space. Another thing that intrigues me about this place is there's a surfer, a very famous surfer, who's not known for his surfing, but known more so for his politics. And this was Prince Jonah Kuhio. A lot of people don't realize that Prince Jonah Kuhio was a surfer in the time when most people were trying to say that surfing was dying out. I'll come back to that in a minute. That concept of surfing dying out is incorrect. And it's something that is used to discredit Hawaiian surfing. But anyway, Prince Kuhio and this place, very significant. Known for his surfing, but known more so for his politics. And this was Prince Jonah Kuhio. A lot of people don't realize that Prince Jonah Kuhio was a surfer in the time when most people were trying to say that surfing was dying out. I'll come back to that in a minute. That concept of surfing dying out is incorrect, and it's something that is used to discredit Hawaiian surfing. But anyway, Prince Kuhio anyway, so as a surfer, he would try and teach the culture through the ocean, through what he knew. And so he would try and influence these other senators and congressmen to vote. And mainly he wanted to pass this bill, Aina Ho'opulapula, the Hawaiian Homestead Act bill. And eventually it does happen. And I don't think he would have been happy with eventually. There was a lot of compromise of location of where they would have these places. But because in some of the locations, it was some of the drier parts of the islands where it was difficult to do the program that he wanted to do, where Hawaiians could live off the land and do these kinds of things. But unfortunately, through those compromises, a lot of the places like Nanakuli and on the west side, there's a lot of dry, harsh climates that was difficult to do these things. But nonetheless, we do have a lot of lands designated nearby us here. Waimea, there's a lot of ranching lands over there for this. And Mauna Kea also was designated as one of these sites for preservation. And it's interesting how places that originally they think have no value, when they later find a value to, it becomes important to them, right? So originally, I don't think they were like, you cannot do nothing up there, give them that. And now it's valuable, right? So it's interesting how we have to fight for it, even though it was given years previously. All right, so Prince Kuhio, also another thing that I think fascinated me, especially yesterday. I don't think a lot of people realize, Prince Kuhio is kind of he's a complicated individual. Some people say that maybe he had compromised a little too and claim it. My great-grandmother fought in the courts for many, many years trying to get her property back. It was 4.5 acres of beachfront property. It's funny, our family doesn't have any land these days, but you see how it happens in many other places, where in Waikiki, for example, you had a lot of these families, including Du Kahanamoku's. It's actually not the Kahanamoku family, it's the Paoa family from his mom's side. They said they had like 50 people living in on this property in Kalia, because there are big plots of property. And it's unfortunate that that we see this trend, and it's sad that we still kind of have this tradition of having to resist. With surfing, however, it's interesting, and one of the things that I argue is that the resistance in the ocean was in many ways more successful in preserving the Hawaiian identity. Today, for example, we have professional surfers. We have a professional surfer right here. And when our professional surfers surf in any competition around the world, they are identified as being from the nation of Hawaii. It's a very unique thing if you think about it. We have a few surfers from Hawaii, and you don't have to be native Hawaiian even. So for Ezekiel Lau is on the world tour. He's native Hawaiian, and he's from Hawaii. But John Florence also who's Kanaka Haole, he's also identified as a Hawaiian surfer. How is that possible? How is it that Hawaiians have their recognized as their own nation in the surfing world? I'll give you another story. There's an amateur world surfing team, and it's called the ISA. And every year they have these teams from all the different countries that go around and compete internationally. Hawaii has had its own team since the beginning of the ISA in 1965. And Hawaii has won gold medals many times over other teams, which include the United States has its own team. I had a very cool experience. I remember once when they first started doing the live internet feed of this competition. It was going on in like Peru, I think. And I was watching online. It was like late at night because I was excited to see how our team was doing. And they ended up winning the gold medal. Now, when you win the gold medal, you come up on the stand and they play your national anthem, just kind of like the Olympics. So I'm like on the edge of my seat, like, what song they gonna play? You know, they gonna get the right one or what? And my hat off to these people in South America that they had done their research and had found Hawaii Pono'i, and they had played it on the stand. So this is a kind of it's a tradition of recognizing Hawaiian independence, and my answer to why that is the case is because Hawaiians have been resisting that and have claiming the ocean as their space from the time of the annexation and overthrow. I did some research at the Outrigger Club. Now, the Outrigger Club has an interesting history. When the Outrigger Club was formed, it was right after the annexation of Hawaii, or the occupation of Hawaii. There was no annexation bill, we know that. But we do know that after this time period that there was a lot of Hawaiians that were surfing in Waikiki. You had the Kahanamokus and a bunch of other Hawaiians that were, there was this real resurgence of surfing that was taking place in Hawaii. One of the things that I believe is the reason why there was this resurgence taking place in surfing was because the ocean still offered that space. You couldn't put fence around it. You couldn't identify, this is my plot, this is yours. You couldn't kick people out of the water. And Hawaiians maintained that space in the ocean. And so when there was a club called the Outrigger Club, and the president of that club was Lauren Thurston, the first one, and then had all of these same guys, was part of the whole overthrow story, had formed this club in Waikiki, and they put a sign up in front that said, "For whites only." And as you can imagine, in Hawaii, like, what the hell? That didn't really sit right with these guys. So there already was a surf club for Hawaiians, and they were called the Huinalu Club. Today there still is a Huinalu Club in Waikiki. They mostly do canoe paddling, but originally that started with Duty Miller, all the Kahanamoku brothers and many others. Now their club was not racially segregated. They had some Haole people, they had some Chinese people, mostly Hawaiians, and they essentially went out into the surf with these guys who had overthrown the queen. By the way, Prince Kuhio is also in that club. And there was a lot of action that happened in the water. And essentially, this Huinalu Club asserted themselves, claiming that space and telling these outrigger guys, we're not going to tolerate your ignorance out here in the water. And from that time, we see that this space as a Hawaiian space through that time of the annexation and overthrow becomes a very powerful place for resistance. And it continues throughout many generations. And so we see it for many generations, including, boy, in the 1950s, they started to do a lot of these shoreline changes in Hawaii. Waikiki most in particular. So they started to demo shorelines, and there was a guy named Walter Dillingham who bought this toy called this dredge machine, and he was just having a heyday dredging up all these places in Hawaii. In fact, if you go to Ala Moana Beach Park, that is an incomplete project from what they planned on doing. You know, there's that deep spot where everybody swims. Kamehameha school kids always have to do the laps over there. Well, that was phase one, was dredge that area. They built in that Magic Island. And the idea then was to connect, pour cement over the reef from Magic Island all the way to Kewalo Basin and put hotels right on top of there. Now, fortunately, there was a group of surfers who pulled together a group called Save Our Surf. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of them. And this group, Save Our Surf, decided they were going to put a stop to this. It's interesting, most of them were local Hawaii kids, they were high school kids. There was a lady auntie named Marion Kelly. She taught ethnic studies at UH Manoa for many years, and her husband, John Kelly, who also was part of the ethnic studies program there. And they mobilized all these kids to kind of do some similar stuff what's going on here today. To go to the state capitol and protest, to stand in front of bulldozers as they came to kind of dredge these places. So through the 1950s and 60s, they were there to save the surf. And they actually stopped that project that was going to build. And there was another project, they were going to make a freeway on the reef from Diamond Head to Cocoa Head. They stopped that one too. There was also a lot of development projects on the west side that they proposed that they shut down. So there is a history of this, I think, that we can draw energy from and realize that our kupuna were a part of doing this kind of thing. And especially around the ocean, we saw a lot of that. All right, you still with me? Okay, so I want to talk about something else that's dear to my heart. It's surfing in Hilo, okay? So I grew up surfing in Hilo in Keokaha at the end of the road there. All those spots actually, from Waiuli to Small Channels to 4 Miles Beach and Chalks and Browns Points times over other teams, which include the United States has its own team. I had a very cool experience. I remember once when they first started doing the live internet feed of this competition. It was going on in like Peru, I think. And I was watching online. It was like late at night because I was excited to see how our team was doing. And they ended up winning the gold medal. Now, when you win the gold medal, you come up on the stand and they play your national anthem, just kind of like the Olympics. So I'm like on the edge of my seat, like, what song they gonna play? You know, they gonna get the right one or what? And my hat off to these people in South America that they had done their research and had found Hawaii Pono'i, and they had played it on the stand. So this is a kind of it's a tradition of recognizing Hawaiian independence, and my answer to why that is the case is because Hawaiians have been resisting that and have claiming the ocean as their space from the time of the annexation and overthrow. I did some research in at the Outrigger Club. Now, the Outrigger Club has an interesting history. When the Outrigger Club was formed, it was right after the annexation of Hawaii, or the occupation of Hawaii. There was no annexation bill, we know that. But we do know that after this time period that there was a lot of Hawaiians that were surfing in Waikiki. You had the Kahanamokus and a bunch of other Hawaiians that were, there was this real resurgence of surfing that was taking place in Hawaii. One of the things that I believe is the reason why there was this resurgence taking place in surfing was because the ocean still offered that space. You couldn't put fence around it. You couldn't identify, this is my plot, this is yours. You couldn't kick people out of the water. And Hawaiians maintained that space in the ocean. And so when there was a club called the Outrigger Club, and the president of that club was Lauren Thurston, this tradition of surfing dying out is a narrative that has undermined the mana of our stories of He'enalu. And fortunately for us, we have Hawaiian language newspapers that talk more in depth about what surfing was doing, and not just of surfing, but our community and what our people were doing. And there's a lot of evidence pointing that actually, no, surfing did not die out just because some of the teachers discouraged kids from doing it. We have a lot of evidence of it actually happening. And so I'd like to point again to Hilo Bay. There's a very rich history of Hilo Bay in the 1890s, just before the overthrow and just after that whole time period where they were having these surfing competitions. And we've recently found all these letters and these stories describing the surfing competitions and how many people showed up and how big of a deal it was. And so in many ways, I think we can celebrate the fact that these traditions of ours that include surfing, culture, resistance, have prevailed throughout our communities. And in fact, one thing that I was hoping to encourage others to look into is that if surfing is just one of these stories, or He'enalu is one of these examples of showing how the Hawaiian community had a space where it was thriving in its culture and resistance, there's got to be many other pockets of it. I think of Hawaiian music, I think of canoe paddling, I think of so many areas that we kind of haven't really looked at when we're only focused on the politics on land. There's actually a lot of examples of resistance and empowerment that's taking place on the ground level in a lot of different areas of our lives. So anyone who's doing any kind of studies or research, I encourage you to find more examples of where our people are actually not just being the victims, but are actually empowered in their own areas and in their own space. Yeah. All right. Told you I was Portuguese. Could talk a long time. Alrighty. One last and kind of unfortunate story of a battle that I've been involved with over the last couple years was, I mentioned how in the surfing world, the surfing community, that they do recognize Hawaii as its own nation. That is currently in jeopardy because the Olympics was recently announced that it would have surfing as one of the games in 2020, next year. When they announced this like 3-4 years ago, I was at this conference where they announced it, and I raised my hand and I said, oh, so what? Is Hawaii gonna have a team in the Olympics? And she looked at me and said, sorry, no. What? That's what I thought. What? No way, no can. So for the last 3 years, I've teamed up with a variety of people, including your dad, Keanu Sai, a bunch of other surfers and professors and lawyers, and we formed what's called the Hawaiian National Olympic Committee, the Hawaiian Kingdom National Olympic Committee, and we submitted an application to the International Olympic Committee, and we hired an attorney to do that and do this paperwork. And I wish I had better news for you to say that it's all good and it's going to happen in 2020, but it's a slow-going process. But I have been committed to try and make sure that Hawaii still has that representation. Technically, by the application's standards and its guidelines, Hawaii does qualify. It says what, because the Olympics oftentimes will recognize countries that have unique situations. For example, there was an Olympic team that was a refugee team. There's also some territories, Puerto Rico, American Samoa, and others have been recognized as their own entity. So we've been working hard to try and get that status for Hawaii. And it has been kind of interesting to notice that it also says that the definition of as a nation is that you've been recognized by the international community as a state, as an independent state. And as most of us may know, that is the case for Hawaii. We have technically been recognized as an independent state many times, and more recently in world courts and other places. So I'm gonna end on that thought, but I'll open it up for questions. We have like 10 more minutes. If you have any questions for me, I would love to try and answer them.
I kind of say F the Olympics in general. So I honor your work for that recognition, but in the same point, can we not maybe put our hearts and support the World Indigenous Games that are happening? I think 2 years ago was Brazil that hosted, and they're bringing back traditional games and traditional indigenous games, and inviting everybody from all over Turtle Island and the Hawaiis and to revive those kind of traditional sports, amongst which surfing is one. So maybe we could. I just don't see much
not worth
good in
any.
the Olympics, I have to say.
Yeah.
And now with the doping and everything, we're talking about superhumans, right? You have to kind of dope to be even competitive on that level. Whereas if you just go and Google World Indigenous Games in Brazil, you could be like, oh shoot, I could do that. You know, like it gives you the hope. It gives the young people the hope that, hey, I could be that person because they're not doping. They're in it for fun. Competition is not the end-all, be-all of the games. It's the games for the game's sake. And I would like to see us falling in love with the World Indigenous Games.
Good one. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, other questions?
Since you mentioned that you were going to be working with Keanu Sai on the international level aspect of the whole international games, are you guys also abiding by, or like going through the international royal court, like how you said?
Yeah, so we're just using the documentation that that where they designated that Hawaii was recognized as an independent state since there wasn't a treaty, and so a lot of it is based off of that. But we're not really going through them per se, but it's using some of the documentation from those hearings and proceedings to send in as application to the Olympic Committee.
Because I know Keanu Sai has a lot of like pull, especially with Italy and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Going through those courts. Have you guys gotten like backing from them?
Yeah, we have, and even from I've seen a lot of people mentioning the Desaias guy that from the UN. We have gotten support letters from individuals like that. Yeah. So. All right. Other questions?
Who's the 5 guys you put in the Olympics?
Here's the thing, I have to say that, and I'm glad you brought this up. I've been talking too much kind of about like clubs of people and people like Duke Hanamoku, and these are all men. Women have been the dominant surfers in Hawaiian history from the beginning of time. If you look at all the stories, the mo'olelos of surfers, Kelea, La'i, Kawai, there's so many that are about women surfers. And to be honest, it sounds like they surfed better than the men. And to be honest, today the women are out surfing our men as well. So like if you look today on the Jeep leaderboard is Carissa Moore. She is Kanaka Maoli, she's from Hawaii. And she's won 3 world titles. Our guys are still kind of struggling to keep up with our wahine, but for sure, mana wahine in the surfing world is a legit thing. We have great kupuna who's led the way, Auntie Rel Sun from Makaha, and many, many other mana wahine in the surfing world who have allowed for that space to be an empowering place for women also. Yeah. So I'm sorry I forgot to mention, spend time on that as well.
Like I was with this group and was translating stuff from John Papai'i, who, as you guys may know, grew up in the front with Kamehameha Liholiho, Kauikeauli, and towards the end of his lifetime in 1870, he writes about the olo, the alaya, and the different types of surfboards, all in Hawaiian, and he goes on to name different types, different breaks, different parts of the island. Ka'u, Hilo, he names one in Hilo. It says it starts from Honoli'i and runs for 15 ahupua'a. 15 ahupua'a, he writes in the newspaper.
Yeah.
And he even writes about Kamehameha, Pai'ea, and him and Ka'ahumanu, and they would canoe surf. And they would even jump off the canoe onto waves. That's how they would mount waves like that.
Yeah.
And he would write them, and it's not just as his, he grew up with them, so he saw them with his own eyes. He writes, oh, he can maka here, yeah, I seen it with my own eyes, and they would do these things, pick off on bombs. And so, like what you're saying, that it's important that we gotta go into Hawaiian newspaper because it's all there, and stuff that we don't know is gonna come out.
Yeah. Yeah. Ew.
I just want to add, as far as like the Olympics and getting recognition there, would definitely tell the world where we stand as far as having our own company.
Yeah.
But I like what Anake was saying about supporting that indigenous things. Yeah. Like why do we feel we need to be there? At that system when we know the truth and we can support something that is actually good for our people.
Yeah.
Indigenous peoples and our islands. So why does it force it?
Well, I will say this
Because you know,
about.
they gonna like hook it down, they gonna like join.
No.
Change the system.
No, one thing that blows me away about Hawaiian surfers is that Hawaii, relatively speaking, is a very small place in comparison to, say, Brazil, Australia. These are like big countries with millions of people. And yet we still have this space where Hawaiians are dominating not only on like the elite level, but they do compete in all these different levels in the longboard divisions, in the women's divisions, in canoe surfing and bodyboarding. There's so many different, Hawaiians are very well rounded when it comes to these ocean activities. And it amazes me. And they do celebrate, even though maybe not at this particular event. I know in Makaha they have like the Buffalo, Big Boy, the Buffalo Classic, where there's all kind of celebration of traditional ways of riding waves, not just with the one shortboard, but with all these different divisions. There are a lot of different areas where Hawaiians are competing in these different events, and not just for competition, but also just for fun. For example, Dwayne DeSoto runs this group called Nakamakai, where he gets all these kids, and the goal is just to have the kids in the water having fun. My family and I ran a group called Halaunalu for like 10 years, where the objective was just to get them in the water to have fun and to learn these things. I was also a surf team coach for Kamehameha schools for like 6 years. And the same thing is just about like, so there's different venues, and it's amazing to me that Hawaiians are competing in all of them and doing really well in them. Other questions?
it's been one of my dreams to kind of create something like that. I mean, step-offs are becoming the new thing, and guys are starting to compete in competitions at ship sterns and stuff like that, where we utilize the jet ski to assist us into waves. And little, unbeknownst to the world, we've been doing step-offs for thousands of years. Like Brother said earlier, you know, jumping out of canoes onto the waves. Some of those things, like, you know, we're doing this resurgence and going back into the past and pulling it into the future. I'd like to encourage everybody to kind of keep that in the, not in the back of your mind, but maybe on the right side. And I'm kind of starting to work with some people because I got hooked on canoe surfing at Makaha Beach. I've had this hook in the corner of my mouth for at least 7 or 8 years now. And kind of encourage you guys, if nobody here has gone and surfed themselves, to go to Waikiki or wherever is closest to you guys. Go out there and experience surfing if you never have yet. Go out there and stand up on a board if you haven't yet. And if you don't feel like you can, get your kids to go and do it. If you don't paddle a canoe, go down to your local canoe hale and tell somebody you want to jump in there and take a few strokes. You never know, you might get addicted to it. You might be walking around with a hook in the corner of your mouth. But I would encourage everybody here to kind of talk about it a lot more, you know. I haven't heard an individual talking about the canoe step-off ever since I found out about it, maybe like 6 or 7 years ago through reading some of the canoe step-off. And it's kind of one of my dreams to see that become a thing, you know. Makaha Beach is the only place where we actually like compete with each other with the canoe. And right now, kind of, it's in the dreaming process of starting a tour around Hawaii. Maybe we can all compete. You know, Hawaiians have been in competition for a long time with each other, and that's, I think, the reason why surfing has come to such a high level is because we're so competitive, and there's reasons why people come out on top of each other, whether it's technology or training or theories or coaching. You know, so I'd be stoked to see every one of you, if you guys could, just head down to the beach and grab the biggest board you can and tell somebody to help push you into a wave. Go to your local canoe hale. Tell them you want to take a couple strokes with the crew and get in there, you know. But just, I always seen surfing as a basis for fun, you know, and it was created specifically for that. And so if you guys could do that, it would help us all out as a people to kind of like grow as a sport. Like I said, we don't really need the Olympics. They kind of need us, and they're kind of taking from us, you know. And everything's kind of starting in Hawaii and leaving Hawaii. I'd like to see things like stay in Hawaii. I don't know, you know, like there's a reason why certain people have become more powerful throughout the world. I know I like to use the Jewish people as an example, as they only spent money with the Jewish people. So not to like segregate anything like that, but we can take that as an example. We can empower our people by using our people. We can keep our jobs in Hawaii. We can keep our technology in Hawaii and everything. And trying to like mix up the pot over here and stir it all up. So I'd be psyched. Any of you guys, if you haven't been on a boat yet, tomorrow make that move. Next week, whenever it is. To see more new faces in the water, to like continue something like that would be awesome.
Mahalo.
Livable dream.
Yeah, mahalo, Pomai. I like to kako what Pomai is saying. If anything you learned today, I started off and throughout the theme was that the Puʻuhuluhulu or the surf zone is a place where we can be empowered. And historically, our kupuna were empowered in those places. So as Pomai is encouraging you guys, encourage your keiki. Sadly, it's harder because all of our beachfront homes now are vacation rentals. I grew up in a neighborhood where me and my friends, a bunch of Hawaiians, would go to the beach every day. I'm sad to go back there. There's one friend, my friend Chewy, who still lives there, but the rest is all pretty much vacation rentals. So you have to make the effort as a parent to like help your kids to experience the ocean, because it's harder for us to live close to it these days. But I also want to recognize the Pomai and what they've done. He's part of this group called the Hawaiian Water Patrol, which Terry Hui and also Brian Keolana and others started, that is world renowned, right? And they really revolutionized and invented the whole rescues on a jet ski with this sled that was also the Hawaiian Water Patrol invented. And because of that, the whole world, whenever they have events in the ocean and stuff, borrows the ingenuity of these Hawaiians who spent time just kind of figuring out, oh, we'll build this sled and attach them and use the ski way better. And he's a part of that group, and I mahalo them for all their efforts. And thank you all for being here today. We're gonna let you go and continue on, and kukia i mauna. Aloha.